Hello and good morning, and welcome to the next Linden webinar for August. And today we'll be talking through some real life G-forces that a pallet experiences on a typical journey. Some research we've been doing. And I think we'll just wait another minute or so and we'll kick off at 12 o'clock. If you're joining us here today, there will be some time at the end of this webinar for questions. So if you have any, pop them in the chat box on the LinkedIn live feed and we'll make sure we answer them at the end. Also, if you have or require any further information at any point during the webinar, you can also put a request in there and we'll help you out at the end. So it's just gone 12, so I think we'll kick off with today's webinar, which is to share with LinkedIn, to share with our clients some research we've been doing into real life forces experienced by pallets in a typical transit journey. So before we start that, bit of an introduction into why we've done this and what we're trying to achieve. So we've been testing, de-acceleration testing pallets now for 2 years. And during this time, we've tested almost every consumer product type out there, I think, including water. We've tested beer, we've tested gin, we've tested spirits, we've tested cat litter, flour, paint, glue, pet food, cans of products, pouches, and 25 kg in bulk sacks. And each different packaging format has its own challenges. But what we've found through experience and through doing a lot of testing and then following up on that testing throughout the supply chain is that if a pallet passes a 0.5 de-acceleration test using the UMOS test method, it stands up well to the rigours of the UK logistic network. We have some specific challenges in the UK transport network. Two of the main ones that come to mind straight away are that we have very poor road surfaces, lots of potholes, cracks, bumps and lumps. And we also have some particularly narrow and winding roads, which also puts extra stress on pallets compared to some of our European friends and definitely other road networks around the world. So whilst we understand very well what the force of braking and acceleration in a truck does to a pallet, for example, an emergency brake at 30 miles an hour is a 0.5 G force on the pallet. We often get asked by customers when we're testing on site, what is the force exerted on the pallet from other hazards in the road? So for example, corners, potholes, roundabouts, general day-to-day driving, starting and stopping, and then what's the difference between an A road, a B road and a motorway? And there's not an awful lot of data out there on the topic. So we've set out and we're on a journey to find out exactly what forces does a pallet come under during a normal transport network journey. And we're on a journey. This is just the first stage of it. There's going to be plenty more information to share in the future. But we found some interesting things out already, so we thought we'd share them in today's webinar. And it's important to note in this test piece and bit of research we did, we weren't trying to solve a stability problem here. All we did was we took a pallet of water from a manufacturer as it arrived to us. We loaded it into a truck, as you can see here, an 18-ton vehicle. We fitted the truck with some cameras and a G-force meter, and then we took it on a pre-described route to find out what happens. As you'll see, we had to stop the journey a little bit earlier than we'd planned, and so some of our further research will carry that on. But we tried to include some of these hazards, so corners, potholes, stopping and starting, traffic lights, poor road surfaces, and speed bumps, roundabouts. And so that's some of the things we'll touch on today as we go through this video. So we've got some video analysis here, as you can see. Across the top, There's 3 video feeds. On the left hand side we have one looking at the axle of the truck from the back of the truck, and that's so we can see what happens to the axle as we go over different road surfaces and hazards. In the middle we have a pallet of water. You will note it's unsupported, so not exactly representative of how it'd be normally loaded in a vehicle, but that gives us the view we wanted to see what happens as it undergoes these different hazards. And then the third video feed on the right is looking at the front of the truck. And across the bottom then you have a G-force graph. There's 2 lines in the graph. The light green line shows side to side movement, so left to right, and then the dark green line shows acceleration and deceleration, so front to back. And there's at the moment it's sat right on the far left hand side, but there's a red line there which will move as we go along, so you can compare the G-forces in real time against what's happening in the videos. I will pause this a few times as we go through, talk through the different hazards and what's happening. So let's start. So the journey starts here. As we can see, the truck moves off and we accelerate. We'll just pause it for a second there. You can see during acceleration we reached a G-force of about 0.25 G during that initial stage of acceleration, and then we reach a steady speed. There's a few bumps which are causing a bit of movement, and we quite quickly then have to de-accelerate for the first corner. And you can see here straight away, if you look at the green line, we're de-accelerating, but quite gently actually, only to minus 0.1 G-force. We go around the corner and you can note now the green line, the light green line here, for a prolonged period goes up to about 1.1.5 G there, and that's just the force as the vehicle turns left. And right now here we had a sharp braking event. So you'll see in a second here the truck had to brake for a vehicle crossing its path. That's the dark green line, which you can see goes to about minus 0.35 G at this point, as the vehicle has to stop suddenly. You can also see, we'll pause and replay that, but you can actually see the pallet moves forward quite sharply as the vehicle brakes quickly there. So if we just play that again, it's going around the corner, and I think it'll do a replay in slow motion. Yeah. So if we watch this again, as we come up to this junction, the truck stops sharply. It's a harsh braking event, and you can see the pallet there moves forward as that happens, and that was to avoid that vehicle coming across its path. Then turns right. You can see the force there on the light green, another 0.2 force on the left to right of the vehicle, and you can see the pallet lean under that force. As we come up to this next junction, it's going to turn left, and you can see now the force back in the other direction there, although not as harsh, quite slowly went around that corner. But as we come around the corner, there's some bumps there you can see, and we'll replay those. But that uneven road surface is causing lots of ups and downs. If we just pause it for a second there, you can see for the last 2 or 3 seconds we had spikes of up to 0.2 G, both in the front to back and side to side directions. So that's shaking the pallet a lot. And if you watch the pallet, we just re-watch that section, you can see that pallet move around a lot as it's shook side to side and front to back. And that's simply just a poor road surface causing that issue. Just watching that again on slightly slower motion as we go over that very rough part. You can see the movement there, side to side, front to back of the pallet. Really shakes it around. And then as we come up to this next junction, the vehicle stops to let the truck out. And you can see that braking happening there. Once again, gentle braking, but we'd reached just over minus 0.2 G braking at that point. As the truck comes round, we accelerate again. You'll notice the acceleration's almost up to 0.3 as we take off. And then he has to brake again, turning right this time. You can see now, if we look at that, there's a 0.3 G force on the left to right direction, the light green line. And you can also see the corresponding lean in the pallet as we go around that corner. Then another steady part of the road, rough road surface, so lots of movement backwards and forwards, side to side. Quite a lot of vibration happening here. And then this is interesting. As we come up to a speed bump, you'll notice the driver brakes to avoid the vibration of the speed bump. But what's worth noticing here is actually that the dark green line drops to over 0.3 G, so minus 0.3 is braking. And the force exerted from braking for the speed bump actually is greater than the speed bump itself. But you can see after that there's a lot of movement as the truck gets back on an even keel. So just watching that slowly happen. Braking up to the speed bump and then side to side movement as it goes over the speed bump. And then some acceleration again up to 0.2 G after the bump. Followed pretty quickly again by another braking event. So this time it's gone from acceleration to braking in quite a quick period of time as we come around the corner. You can see here the green line reaches 0.2 again, and the pallet's leaning as it does that. So we can see that lean on the pallet caused by that prolonged period of G-force at 0.2. And then probably the harshest event of the whole journey is coming up as the next thing we'll look at. But there's a very poor road surface here, uneven road and a massive pothole that the vehicle goes over. You can see that there, how much it shook the truck. That will replay now as we go over that slowly. So I'm just going to pause it there because I think it's worth looking at this point in particular. Although it's a very momentary and very short spike there, you can see that left to right we reached a force of almost 0.9 G, so it's a massive sideways force. And front to back we reached a force of almost minus 0.5 G, so it's a pretty large front to back force as well. And although they're only there for milliseconds, that spike is a jolt and it's a shock, and that shock can cause damage to packaging. And we'll look at that a bit further on when we discuss some of the findings from this, but that really weakens the packaging, and you'll see that in the rest of the journey now. You can see the aftershock now happening as the vehicle drives on from that, so everything's shaking around. And then we come up to the next junction, and you can see some braking happening, fairly gentle braking at minus 0.2, and then the vehicle stops. There's some temporary traffic lights on the road here. So we'll just speed through this section, speed it up a bit because it's not an awful lot happening. Then as the traffic lights go green, you can see the vehicle in front moves and the truck accelerates off. Once again, we're hitting a force of 0.3 G during our acceleration period. And as he's driving up the middle, because it's obviously temporary roadworks here, there's a lot of unevenness in the road, so there's a lot of side-to-side movement. We'll just pause it and have a look there. You've got forces of anywhere between +2 to -0.3 G happening on left to right. And if you watch the pallet, you'll notice it really shakes the pallet around in doing that. And then the next hazard we come up to is a level crossing, which are always uneven things to cross. You can see there's a lot of shaking going on as you go over that. Followed by braking, coming up to the next roundabout. At this point, I think the vehicle would have been doing about 40 miles an hour. So we're braking from 40 miles an hour down to probably about 15 or 20 miles an hour as a speed. And then we start going around the roundabout, and this is pretty much where we had to abort the test. You'll see why in a minute. But I think it's worth talking about this here. So although the roundabout only exerts a force of 0.3 G in its top point, you'll notice it's a sustained period of G-force to the left of the vehicle. And what we often see, and this is just proven it yet again, is that sustained force can do a lot more damage than a temporary spike. And you can see exactly what plays out here. So as we enter that period of 0.2, 0.3 G to the one side of the vehicle, that pallet finally gives up and collapses over. So we aborted the test at this point. We'll just watch that happen again in slow motion. So you can see as we go around the corner and we're reaching about 0.3, that force is too much for the pallet. It's already been weakened by previous jolts and bumps, and it tips over completely. And then as we come out the roundabout, we're back onto a fairly good A-road surface. A lot better than the industrial state that we were driving around, so it's much smoother, doing about 40 miles an hour, but you can see the kind of 0.1 up and down bumps just from general vibration in transport. So that concludes our initial findings, and there's so much more we want to find out now, and as we do, we'll share it with you. It's been a very fascinating project. There's a few key conclusions we've taken from this, which I'll go over in a minute. But there's also a lot of other hazards we want to look at. And as we do this investigation, take it further, look at other different scenarios, we'll certainly be sharing it during these monthly webinars. So in conclusion, what did we find out? In this short journey, we regularly achieve forces of between 0.3 and -0.3, so acceleration and then deacceleration, 0.3 G. So the first conclusion we'd make is if your pallets don't pass a 0.3 G deacceleration test, you've got absolutely no chance really of getting your goods to your customer safely. And surprisingly, we still find pallets that are failing the UMOS test at 0.3. But I'd say this is the very, very bare minimum that you should be testing to for your pallet to survive in any transit network. You can see, although that's the average, we had some spikes quite significantly above 0.3 happen. The second point really, which was played out by the roundabout, is that the duration of the force is as important as the intensity. So you get sharp events such as speed bumps, potholes, which are a spike of a high force and they come straight back down again. And then things like braking, acceleration and cornering provide a longer duration of a lower G-force. But that duration can sometimes cause more damage than a very intense but short shock to the pallet. And it's worth noting at this point, the UMOS test we test to the G-force for 300 milliseconds. So it's a period of 0.3 of a second that we test for. I think the third point that this testing is confirmed for us is it really reiterates to us the importance of deacceleration testing in both directions of travel. So across the width of the pallet and across the length of the pallet. Typically, it's easy to concentrate on direction of travel only and say, well, that's where most of the force happens, braking and deacceleration. And whilst that's important, what we see from this test here is there's significant G-forces exerted across the vehicle as well, so left to right. So when you're testing, it's very important to test in both directions. Depending on your stack pattern, you may have a pallet that's very stable, for example, front to back, but quite weak left to right. And then you might typically find it's always falling over on roundabouts, but never falling over on acceleration or deacceleration. So when you're testing, very important to test both directions. And then the fourth point, which I think we saw play out during this video, is the point of packaging fatigue. So every force, every impact damages the packaging a little bit, and that causes fatigue. So if we'd started with the roundabout, that pallet may have survived it absolutely fine, but because it had already gone through a series of different stresses, different forces, by the time we got there, it was weakened to a point where it fell over. And I think that just highlights the importance of always giving yourself a safety factor. So if you think on a typical journey you're achieving 0.3s and 0.4 G-forces, you need to give yourself a safety factor, and that will give you peace of mind and the certainty that when you put your pallets into the network, into the transport network, that they survive everything. Don't just go for the bare minimum, because likely something will happen, an out of extraordinary event, and then you're going to have a situation where your pallets fall over or get damaged in transit. So I think that summarizes our findings so far. We've found it insightful. We will be creating a white paper which will summarize these different parts, and so if you'd like a copy of that, drop your details into the chat and we'll get something across to you. And in the meantime, we've got 5 minutes or so for questions, so if you have any questions, pop them in the chat as well, and I'll do my best to answer them now. Just see what's come through. So the first question that's come through is, how do you test whether a pallet will hold up to a sustained period of G-force? And that's a very good question. I think the first point is the UMOS test is a sustained period. It's 300 milliseconds. So if you're doing a deacceleration test, you're certainly not just testing for a spike in G-force, you're testing it over a period of time. So that would definitely take you some way to testing that. Another way would be able to use a tilt test. So you would lift the pallet to a predefined level angle, and then leave it there for a period of time and then come back and check that the pallet's still stable and hasn't moved. And if you'd like any more information, we can do tilt testing. We have that equipment here in the Innovation Centre. So if you'd like any more information on that, give us a shout and we'll talk you through how we could do that. Next question has come through is, what does this mean for me as a company? Well, I think what it means is if you are a company that's manufacturing and distributing products throughout the UK or Europe, you have a responsibility to ensure your product gets there safely. And what this initial findings really tell us is that it confirms our experience now with data we've got here, that any pallet that passes a 0.5 G UMOS test will stand up to the typical hazards on the UK road network. And really for us, that would be the minimum you should be striving to achieve, to make sure that your pallets do stand up and withstand a 0.5 G test. If you haven't yet done pallet stability testing, so you don't know how your pallets do survive that kind of rigor, I strongly encourage you to look into it and see how you can get it done, because the findings you'll get that from that are invaluable in improving your packaging and making your pallets safer for transit. Someone else is asking, how would you go about solving this pallet falling over? Which is a very good question. And I think I'd start off with saying that water bottles are notoriously difficult. They're probably one of the most difficult products to pack and ensure they remain stable. But there's a few things we'd look at, starting with the primary packaging itself. The stability or the rigidity of the bottle, how can you improve that? Lightweighting has made the bottles typically quite a bit weaker and more flexible. So some water companies are now looking at ways of pressurizing those bottles, even if the water isn't carbonated, just to improve rigidity. So that's point number one. Number two is, once that bottle is then packed in a heat shrink pack, as this one is, you need to ensure your heat shrink's been shrunk to the right level at the right heat, so there's no stretch left in that, and that you have a very rigid and solid pack. Once that's done, you'll want to look at the movement between layers and how you can reduce or eliminate that movement. And typically there's a few ways of doing this, using anti-slip layer sheets, or depending on the stack pattern, potentially you could use a stabilization adhesive to stop the layers moving. That leads on to stack pattern, so make sure you've got the best stack pattern for stability. And then finally, once that's all done, the stretch film on the outside, you need to make sure you've got the right holding force. You've got sufficient holding force. You want to make sure your film is stretched to the correct level, and that it has been locked out. You haven't got stretch left in the film. You want to make sure you have the right film, a film that's got a high holding force. And then when you're applying it, put it in the right places. So you don't need too much around the top. You need most of your film around the base to hold it to the pallet. So I think that's most of the questions done. There's one more here: how to access these results. So we'll create a white paper on this, summarizing these different forces experienced and a few points on what you can do about it. Just get in contact with us, either in the chat now or through our website, and we'll get you a copy across in the next week or so. Thank you very much for joining our August webinar. We hope you found it interesting and insightful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.